Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to teach you an effective guide of how to wall bounce. Now what's going to be interesting is we're going to do this as a guide from a beginner's perspective to an advanced user. So let us begin. Now what's going to be helpful is that this guide is going to be for a general audience, whether you're on controller or M&K, but we do have a mouse and keyboard overlay for you to help. Now this is going to be a much easier thing to do on mouse and keyboard, and it will be a little bit more difficult to do on controller, and we'll discuss which parts are. Now the most simple thing that you need to learn that most individuals struggle with when they wall bounce is perfecting the slide jump. Now the best tip I can provide of why the slide jump is so important, as this is where you're going to gain your maximum momentum to wall bounce. Now whenever you slide jump, you need to make sure that before you do so that you see your hands run in front of you. If you have an heirloom, there'll be an animation where you are spinning your heirloom and it'll settle back in place. But once you see the hands, you'll ensure that you're not going to dead slide. What a dead slide is before you have the momentum of where your hands come out, where you don't really slide and you have this, there it is right there, that really slow momentum that isn't at max peak. So you want to ensure that you're at max peak. And the reason for that is you want all the momentum to ensure when you wall bounce, so you're gaining as much speed back to push off the wall. So what you're doing in this action is that you are sliding, you're holding crouch, and then you are jumping right afterwards. You can do what toggle, which I have bound to my Z, and that's just my own personal preference. And then I also have hold. Holding is a little harder to do, even on controller. Holding is much more difficult to do because it requires a bit of an extra movement there. I have mine bound to the C key. I'm not as consistent whenever I use hold. I prefer to toggle. Whenever you toggle it, it's a little easier to stop and start and get that movement and more cadence. So perfect this. Practice what's going to be best for you, because this is a key component that I see every beginner struggle with when it comes to perfecting your wall bounce. Now let's talk about adding this as the first step to your wall bounce. Whenever you're wall bouncing, what you want to do is gain that max momentum and slide jump into the wall. Now when you slide jump, you got to pretend that you're a crash test dummy. This is really important. You don't want to do it too soon or else you hit the bottom of this, and you don't want to do it too late or else you might accidentally, not really time the jump properly if you do it way too late. And sometimes I see that happen where you run in and then you get stuck right here. So what you want to do is make sure you're at the perfect peak, and this is a really good example and a good spot to practice from, and then you wall bounce off, essentially. So whenever you slide jump, wall bounce, let's break down what this whole movement is, and then we're going to start to get more and more advanced. So what you're doing when you become the crash test dummy, what you want to do is practice ensuring that you can just run into the wall, and it looks like your character is about to climb. You don't have to press any inputs once you're there. You slide jump, and of course you got to wait for your hands to come out, which is why this is a perfect spot and a good example. You go right here, you hit, and what you're going to do once you hit that wall is that you're going to jump off. Now you have a little bit extra time to be able to do this just for a simple wall bounce. Whenever you slide jump, you wait, you can wait and then jump after, which is why in controller that it's not necessarily an impossible movement to do. It's just all about timing. Now when you time it better, you can use your scroll wheel to help time it a bit better. Now, what I recommend if you are changing your settings here is that you utilize that. So I utilize both space and scroll wheel down to ensure that I can bounce off the wall effectively. This is going to be important, and it's going to be a lead up. So if you're watching this video, we're constantly adding and building. So we slide jump, and then you press jump through space bar, or if you're on controller, you press jump once you're like Spider-Man, once you are stickied to the wall, right? And there's your wall bounce. Now you practice this in the perfect cadence, back and forth. You see your arms run out, and then this is where you have mastered essentially a basic wall bounce. You don't need to press any input. It's a leap of faith. Whenever you're slide jumping and going against the wall, that leap of faith is very important, because you don't necessarily have to keep pressing W. And of course, if you do, let's showcase what it looks like, then you're just going to climb up and do some weird animations. Now, there's going to be an extra level to this whenever you are actually wall bouncing on geometry that is actually lower. So let's talk about that. Now, if you were trying to wall bounce off something that's a little bit more difficult, let's say right here, if you don't press any input, you'll notice that it looks like you're trying to go into a climbing animation. Now, when you see more advanced players wall bouncing and doing these type of movement tech especially, what you want to do is you slide jump. See what you're going to do. Let's break this down again, just in case you didn't get it here. You slide jump, and you're going to use your slide, which is toggle, or, hold, whichever one. Slide jump. And then what you're going to do is another wall bounce. Now, to get the extra layer here to wall bounce properly, and I'll show you what that looks like right here, You're like, how did you do that? Well, the biggest thing is to press a direction. On controller, this is a little bit more difficult because you got to press a direction right beforehand. So what you're doing is you're pressing A or D right before you hit the wall. And it's all about timing. This is why the slide jump is so essential and so important. Because if you don't get the slide jump perfect on landing on a target and you don't know where it stops and where it ends, then you might miss the wall bounce, right? And we're showing a lot more objects geometry here, and the reason why I'm showcasing it because you're holding A and D because what you're trying to do is showcase a direction. If you don't showcase a direction, your character is assuming that you want to climb, and otherwise you do this weird sticky animation and it just doesn't work. So A and D in your controller left and right before, like you can use it as like a direction to kind of lean in. As you're pushing, you're like, I'm gonna lean in that direction, then you wall bounce off. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna lean this other direction, then I'm gonna wall bounce off, right? Think of it as like a lean as you're going in. That lean is going to help you really get the wall bounce effective. So now let's break down what we've taught. We know we slide jump, and then we jump off the wall, the leap of faith, right? And now if you wanna go lower geometry, you have to kind of lean in like a car towards that object. Now, the basis here is really understanding the slide jump though. The hardest part is literally the slide jump in my opinion, because you got to understand where your slide jump goes and where it stops and become that crash test dummy so you line it perfectly. And that's where really the trouble comes from. Now, some extra little bit of layer here is adding that direction of ensuring you can wall bounce, you know, in a different direction. So let's say right next to the wall. So this type of wall bounce right here. Now there's two different ways you can do it. You can showcase the leap of faith where you don't showcase a direction at all and you just kind of like slide in that direction by pressing A or D right beforehand, or use a controller to move towards that direction but not hold it. Or you can tap strafe into it. And if you want a tap strafe guide in this channel, let me know. But we're going to keep this strictly wall bouncing. So in this example, I'm just going to show the movement tech. We're pressing A and D. You want to lean towards it, right? The same thing that you're leaning towards this, you want to lean towards that wall bounce. You can do it two ways, A or D or the leap of faith. I think it's better over time to practice always pressing A and D because this leads to every other movement tech that you're trying to learn, which is very, very important. Remember how I said how important and vital it was that we're going to keep building upon everything, right? Now, what we're going to talk about now is the most advanced version of a wall bounce, which is called a fatigue wall bounce. So let's get into that. Now, as we're getting a lot more advanced, let's discuss a fatigue wall bounce. A fatigue wall bounce is very interesting because it requires two pieces of the puzzle, well, multiple pieces as we're building up. One of the most interesting ones is understanding what a fatigue state is. Now, a fatigue state, and we're going to showcase this in third person as well, is whenever you jump, you have, let's say, a bigger jump, which looks like so. Let's take a look at this in third person so you can take a look at it. Now let's take a look at the fatigue state. See how the jumps aren't as high? You're kind of doing this small bounce, but if you wait a second, you got your jumping power back, right? This is what we call a fatigue state. Now the fatigue state is actually very interesting. You would think that this would be a negative, right? But we're going to turn it into a positive, and it's going to tie back to our wall bounce and wall jumping techniques. So what we're going to do is we're going to bunny hop or even fatigue, and we don't necessarily have to do a bunny hop, fatigue near a wall and do a wall bounce. So now that you've seen what a wall bounce looks like when you're doing it properly, and let's showcase whenever you don't do it properly. There it is, where you kind of have that climbing animation, right? Now, what's very interesting about a fatigue wall bounce, let's talk about what we're doing here. All we're doing is doing a simple jump, and then afterwards we look at the wall, and then we kind of Spider-Man towards it and press A and D. Remember the advanced techniques that we were discussing earlier? Making sure that we kind of have that arc, that direction, right? Now what we're doing is tying it all together. So we just jump once and then press A or D. And if you're on controller, just make sure you sticky to the wall. This is where it makes it a little bit more accessible if you're on controller, because that timing is not necessarily perfect. Like you see how I'm pressing spacebar right there. Instead, it doesn't have to be net perfect. All you got to do is fatigue, sticky to the wall. It's almost like you're Spider-Man, the crash test dummy. Make sure that you're sticking for a second. And you can do extra things with this, which is interesting. You don't have to slide jump, and you can keep all your momentum. You just have to make sure that you're jumping towards the wall and make sure that you're building that. So what we're doing there is we're essentially jumping once, wait for fatigue state, move forward just a little bit, and then bouncing off. It's really just making sure that you crash test dummy on the wall and then jump. You see how there's that delay there? Now, if you're not fatigued, let's showcase what a fatigue looks like versus a non-fatigue jump. So if you're not fatigued, you bounce down, right? You essentially go up and then it pushes you off. But if you fatigue and then you bounce, then you go up. And the reason why it's going to propel you up because there's nowhere to go in terms of down momentum and movement. I think this is a lot more interesting. Hopefully this is helpful. So what we covered today, just to recap, to make sure that you fully understand The guide is to make sure that you understand your timing whenever you slide jump. Now, what your goal is to slide jump like a crash test dummy to where you always have that perfect climb right there, where it's like you're Spider-Man, you're climbing along the wall. Now, whenever you do so, all you got to do to wall bounce is just jump. Now, we tie this together with something a little bit more complex by adding a bounce off of geometry that's low hanging, because if you don't do it correctly, then you essentially go into a weird climbing animation. So we'll show that again, where you push off. And then a fatigue state, where you're next to this. And then once you're in the fatigue state, after bouncing for a second, then you bounce off. This is definitely helpful. Where all this is applicable is to ensure that you're bouncing off of walls and targets and moving around properly to get away from targets. You can use it around doors. You can use it to maintain momentum while you're reloading. This mechanic is used to dodge and to throw off an opponent. It can be used offensively to ensure that your opponent is wasting bullets, but your goal is to get them to miss. If you can get them to miss, then you can get them to lose the encounter. Let us know what you thought of this guide. Was this helpful? Did this help you improve your wall bouncing? We can add extra layers of techniques. Let us know in the comment section down below, such as bunny hopping or even tap strafing. We can cover that here on the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to leave a like and comment, subscribe, and I'll see you guys all in the next one.